Welcome to Shmirchik, Catcher's Corner, where you'll experience all the unpleasantness that comes with me, including parties, sneezing, wheezing, snoozing, sniffing, moving, switching, itching, and everything else. If you can handle that, then welcome. This is continuation of Sigmund Freud. Just talking about him, and because it's always something that I wanted to. It's something that I wanted to always get into. Yeah, hold on. So it's working. System works. Amazing. Let me open the door for my cat. What, Amber? Okay. Turn on the heat. So where do we go from there? Where do we end off? Right? So we're up to development of psychoanalysis. What he's done, right? So let's go back to we're still talking about the Oedipus complex. Yeah? The Oedipus complex, right? So this is Freudian's theoretic revision of the Oedipus complex, right? And the Oedipus complex is about how, like, there's a myth in Greek mythology that there's like a made-up story about how a Greek guy comes and kills his father. He doesn't know it's his father. He kills his father in order to marry his mother, you know? And it's all about, like, a child's attraction or wanting to take possession of the opposite sex parent, right? So in response to Freud's proposal of Oedipus complex, which was initially more focused on the little boy's experience of desire for the mother and jealous rivalry in the relation of the father, student collaborator Carl Jung proposed that girls experience desire for their father and aggression towards the mother via what he called the Electra complex. Electra was a Greek mythological figure who plotted matricidal revenge with Orestes, her brother, against her mother Clytemnestra and her stepfather Aegisthus for the murder of her father Agamemnon. Like Oedipus, the character is a subject of a play by Sophocles' Electra from the 5th century BC. Orthodox Jungian psychology uses the term Oedipus complex only to denote a boy's psychosexual development. Freud himself rejected the equivalence, arguing that at this stage of development, it is only the male who experiences a simultaneous love for one parent and competitive hatred for the other. For Freud, the idea of Electra complex, which talks about the girl, assumed an analogous relation between boys and girls in relation to their same and opposite sex parents. That does not actually exist. According to Freud, the Electra complex fails to take the account of the differing effects of the castration complex. And so basically the boys complex is more likely to be something of more truth to it because they have the extra fear of the castration complex. They're afraid to get castrated by their father, right? And the significance of phallus in the two sexes and overlooking the girl's pre-Oedipal attachment to the mother. Otto Rank, right? So there's something called Otto Rank. Otto Rank. It's a classical Freudian psychology, the superego, the heir to the Oedipus complex, is formed as the infant boy internalizes the familial rules of his father. In contrast, in the early 1920s, using the term pre-Oedipal, Otto Rank proposed that a boy's powerful mother was the source of the superego in the course of normal psychosexual development. Rank's theoretic conflict with Freud excluded him from the Freudian inner circle. So this guy had a different type of philosophy and he was excluded from the inner circle. Nonetheless, he later developed the psychodynamic object relations theory in 1925, which is it's a school of thought in psychoanalytical theory and psychoanalysis centered around theories of stages of ego development Its concerns include the relation of the psyche to others in childhood and the exploration of relationships between external people and as well as internal people. Okay, so Melanie Klein, right? Hi, Wall Street Techs. You want a girl just like mom? Yeah, I'm sure of it. Right? So, yeah, back to Freud. Right, so, where were we? Okay, so, Melanie Klein. Whereas Freud proposed that the paternal phallus was central to infantile and adult psychosexual development. So the father is like important into a baby's life, right? In their sexual development. Melanie Klein concentrated on the early maternal relationship, proposing the Oedipal manifestations as perceptible in the first year of life, the oral stage. Her proposal was part of the controversial discussions at the British Psychoanalytical Association. The Kleinian psychologists proposed that underlying Oedipus complex, as Freud described it, there is an earlier layer of more primitive relationship with the Oedipal couple. She assigned dangerous destructive tendencies not just to the father but also to the mother in her discussion of the child's projected fantasies. Klein's concept of the depressive position resulting from the infant's ambivalence towards the mother lessened the central importance of the Oedipus complex in psychosexual development. Like, I feel like there's so much like emphasis put on a baby in the first year of life on how they develop and what goes on in their mind, and able to, like, they talk about a baby as like the first year of their life, like being something that is, it affects the rest of their life, you know, and it affects their sexual development in the later stages of their life, right? So there's here, let me show you what I'm looking at. Wilfred Bion. For the post-Kleinian Bion, the myth of Oedipus concerns investigatory curiosity, the quest for knowledge rather than sexual difference. The other main character in the Oedipal drama becomes Tiresias. In Greek mythology, Tiresias was a blind prophet of Apollo in Thebes, famous for clairvoyance, and for being clairvoyance is like being psychic, and for being transformed into a woman for 7 years. Wow. So he became a woman. He was the son of the shepherd Everus and the nymph Chariclo. Tiresias participated fully in 7 generations in Thebes, beginning an advisor to something. The false hypnosis erected against anxiety about a new theory. As a result, Bion regarded the central crime of Oedipus as his insistence on knowing the truth at all costs. Okay, so I don't understand this at all. Like, Oedipus was somebody who went and killed his father in order to be with his mother, right? But what does that have to do with knowing the truth, you know, at all costs, right? So, I don't know. If you guys understand this more than I do. Hi, Redbeard. Where are we? 1 second. I'm just trying to show you what I'm looking at. Oedipus was wrong. Why do you say he was wrong? Freud had a mother complex. Did he really? She likes guys with facial hair like that. Freud has a mother complex. Why do you say that? I only speak to big old booty women like mom. The Oedipus, it's basically a story about a guy that went and killed his mother. So why was he wrong? What, the theory is wrong? Like, what? Right, so Jacques Lacan argued against removing the Oedipus complex from the center of the psychosexual development experience. For him, the Oedipus complex is so far as we continue to recognize it as covering the whole field of our experience with its signification. It may be said to mark the limits that our discipline assigns to subjectivity. It is that which superimposes the kingdom of culture upon the person, marking his or her introduction to the symbolic order. You see, all this I can't understand. It's too vague. Thus, the child learns that what power independent of itself is as it goes through the Oedipus complex, encountering the existence of a symbolic system independent of itself. Moreover, Lacan's proposal that the ternary relation of the Oedipus complex liberates the prisoner of the dual relationship of the son-mother relationship proved useful to later psychoanalysis. There's definitely something to this whole Oedipus complex, because there's a lot of... I feel like the Oedipus complex, it's basically children who feel this rivalry against their parent. But I feel like more than that, there's a bigger issue with parents with their connection to their children. I feel like it's more messed up. You know what I'm saying? Oedipus. High carnage collectibles. Electro complexes for females, exactly. Yeah. So, yeah, let's go back. Fine. So I feel like there's less of a problem with children's feelings towards their parent. I feel like there's more of an issue with the parents' feelings towards their children, So, moreover, Lacan's proposal that ternary relation of the Oedipus complex liberates the prisoner of the dual relationship of the son-mother relationship proved useful to later psychoanalysis. Thus, for Bolas, the achievements of the Oedipus complex is that the child comes to understand something about the oddity of possessing one's own mind, discovers the multiplicity of points of view. Likewise, for Ronald Britton, if the link between the parents perceived in love and hate can be tolerated in the child's mind, this provides us with a capacity for seeing us in interaction with others and for reflecting on ourselves. So basically, a child's ability to see objectively and to be able to see different points of view helps them to understand their parents better and helps them to be able to get along with humans. Does that make sense? Or behavior is modeled from parent and so for reflecting on ourselves, wisping ourselves. As such, the dove that returns, the dove that vanishes, 2000, Michael Parsons proposed that such a perspective permits viewing the Oedipus complex as a lifelong developmental challenge, with new kinds of Oedipus configurations that belong to later life. I don't understand this. In 1920, Sigmund Freud wrote that with the progress of psychoanalysis studies, the importance of the Oedipus complex has become more and more clearly evident. Its recognition has become the shibboleth that distinguishes the adherents of psychoanalysis from its opponents. Thereby, it remains a theoretical cornerstone of psychoanalysis until about 1930, when psychoanalysts began investigating the pre-Oedipal son-mother relationship within the theory of psychosexual development. Janet Malcolm, so other people are looking into this. Janet Malcolm reports that by the late 20th century, to the object relations psychology avant-garde, the events of the Oedipal period are pallid and inconsequential in comparison with the cliffhanging psychodramas of infancy. For Kohut, as for Winnicott and Ballant, the Oedipus complex is an irrelevance in the treatment of severe pathology. Pathology is the study of abnormal cognition behavior and experiences which differs according to social norms and rests upon a number of constructs that are deemed to be socially normal. Nonetheless, so it's something that's not normal in understanding. Its irrelevance in the treatment of severe, mental problems. Nonetheless, ego psychology continued to maintain that the Oedipus period, roughly 3.5 to 6 years, is like Lorenz standing in front of the chick. Konrad Le Carrier's Lorenz was an Austrian zoologist ethologist and ornithologist. He shared the 1973 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine with Nicholas Tinbergen and Karl von Frisch. He is often regarded as one of the founders of the modern ethology, the study of animal behavior. Okay. So this guy's theory about animal behavior is the most formative, significant, molding experience of human life, according to his saying. He says that roughly 3.5 to 6 years it molds your human experience. If you take a person's adult life, his love, his work, his hobbies, his ambitions, they all point back to the Oedipus complex, which is basically how they relate to their parents, like trying to possess the parent of the opposite sex, right? Do you guys understand this? Or is this beyond anything we understand? I'm better than father. I too will have a gal with big old booty. Wall Street tech, that's too much booty. Okay, so we'll continue. Fine. So, lack of imperial basis. Studies conducted of children's attitudes to parents at the Oedipal stage do not demonstrate the shifts in positive feelings that are predicted by the theory. Case studies that Freud relied upon, such as the case of little hands, could not be verified through research or experimentation on a larger population. So it's all up in the air, and that's, I think, why part of his studies is pseudoscience. It's not really scientific, like scientific as in like biologically scientific. Like pseudoscience is something like they call the like the people who are clairvoyant, like psychic. That's a pseudoscience. It's the brain, something in the brain thinking, I guess, right? Okay, so it's also pseudoscience is also like body language is pseudoscience. The machine, the lie detector. Adolf Grombaum argues that the type of evidence Freud and his followers used, the clinical productions of patients during analytical treatment, by their nature cannot provide cogent observational support for Freud's core hypothesis. Evolutionary psychologists Martin Daly and Morgan Wilson, I'll show you what I'm reading, in their 1988 book Homicide, argue that Oedipus complex theory yields few testable predictions. They find no evidence of the Oedipus complex in people. There is evidence of parent-child conflict, but it's not for sexual possession of the opposite-sex parents. Yeah, I kind of agree with that, because I feel like children don't feel sexual desire for a parent. They just want a close bond. So maybe Freud was correct about his theory about children wanting to possess a parent over their other parent, but it's not sexual. It's more of a like father-daughter bond. According to psychiatrist Jeffrey Lieberman, Freud and his followers resisted subjecting his theories, including the Oedipus theory, to scientific testing and verification. Lieberman claims that investigations based on cognitive psychology either contradict or fail to support Freud's ideas. Okay, so this is something that I really want to talk about. Cover for sexual abuse. This is what I was waiting for, but I was going in order, right? So, cover for sexual abuse, and that's something I discussed in my first video, right, on this. Yeah, I forget what it was, but we'll talk about it, right? So, I forget what exactly, Sigmund Freud, he basically switched his whole reason for people being neurotic when they're older. He got it right. I think he got it correct the first time when he talks about the reason why a lot of people have all these mental disorders when they're older. It all stems, and it goes back to childhood sexual abuse, right? And then he switched it to the Oedipus complex, right? Because he decided that, fitting in with his times, I guess he didn't have the balls to stand on what he really believes, which is about people's neurotic behavior and hysteria go back to childhood sexual abuse. Instead, he switched it to people having the Oedipus complex, which is a baby, a child trying to possess the parent of the opposite sex sexually. You know what I'm saying? Right? So, yeah. In 1970, social worker Florence Rush wrote that Freud's seduction theory, which came early in his career, correctly attributed his patient's memories of childhood trauma to the patient's family, often the father, implying that widespread sexual abuse of children by parents was common in his society. According to Rush, the discovery of this abuse made Freud uncomfortable. So he abandoned the theory and invented the Oedipus complex to replace it. The Oedipus complex allowed him to attribute stories of childhood sexual abuse to the children themselves. Basically putting the sexual abuse that a child suffers on the child as in them being their responsibility for initiating this type of abuse. Freud came to the conclusion that the stories were fantasies of hidden desires rather than factual descriptions of trauma. So he had all these people coming to him, right? And he was like doing all his like psychoanalysis and stuff. And he would do also his hypnosis, and he would hear all about like these patients that would talk about their repressed memories of childhood, of things that might have happened to them, and it all pointed back to their being abused as a child, right? So he was uncomfortable with that, right? Freud came to the conclusion that stories were fantasies of hidden desires rather than factual descriptions of trauma. Thus, Rush argues Freud covered up illegal and immoral sexual abuse by undermining the perceptions of his patients, particularly his female patients. So there was that added element of misogyny. Rush's theory became known as the Freudian cover-up. It's a very good. I kind of agree with that. That's what I thought. Like when I was reading him in the other video, the first video, right? So the Freudian cover-up is a theory introduced by social worker Florence Rush in 1971, which asserts that Sigmund Freud intentionally ignored evidence that his patients were victims of sexual abuse. The theory argues that in developing his theory of infant sexuality, he misinterpreted his patients' claim of sexual abuse as symptoms of repressed ancestral desire. Therefore, Freud claimed that children who reported sexual abuse by adults had either imagined it or fantasized the experience. Wow. Rush introduced the Freudian cover-up in her representation of the sexual abuse of children, a feminist point of view about childhood sexual abuse and incest at the April 1971 New York Radical Feminist Rape Conference. The theory, though under a different name, was given further promotion in 1984 through the publishing of the book Assault on Truth, Freud's Suppression of the Seduction Theory by psychoanalyst Jeffrey Moussaieff Mason. He believed he independently came to the same conclusion as Rush through his review of the materials in the Freud archives. Well, so, yeah, this is very interesting, right? So, right? This is very interesting. Okay, so let's go back to I forgot to ask for your primary language. A Freudian slip. Is that where the whole Freudian slip comes from? Like his cover-up of this whole thing? You know? Right? So she's the one that comes up with that, right? So continue, she argues. A director of the Sigmund Freud archives, this guy, Jeffrey Moussaieff Mason, adopted the view that Freud's work was a cover-up for abuse after reading Freud's unpublished letters in his book of Assault on Truth. Mason argues that Freud misattributed accounts of sexual abuse to fabrications and fantasies of children because, for personal reasons, he was unable to accept the accounts that they were real. According to Mason, among Freud's reasons to suppress the abuse was that he did not want to be confronted by the father of a patient who was accused of committing abuse. Late in his career, Freud sought to prevent colleague Sandor Ferenczi from delivering a paper that reasserted the seduction theory. The seduction theory, what was the seduction theory? Right? Let's go to the seduction theory. Seduction theory was... seduction theory emphasizes the causative impact of nurture and the shaping of a mind by experience. The theory held that hysteria and obsessive according to the theory, a repressed memory, a molestation experience was an essential precondition for hysterical and obsessive symptoms, with the addition of an active sexual experience up to the age of 8 for the latter. So his seduction theory was that their experience, right? Their experience really was essential to, hold on. Their experience was essential to their symptoms later on in life. I think that's what it's trying to say, right? So, going back to the seduction theory, right? So, you see, it gets really deep, right? So, let's continue. So, where were we? Okay, so she wanted to give in a paper for the seduction theory. He didn't want her to. Freud had hoped that his former student would abandon the theory as he himself had done, but Ferenczi delivered the paper in 1932. Mason writes that because the theory of the Oedipus complex became widely popular, psychoanalysts continued to do damage to their patients by doubling the reality of the patient's early memories of trauma. Oh, so they doubt the reality of the patient's early memories of the trauma because of this, the Oedipus complex, which puts the responsibility of a child fantasizing about being with a parent sexually, So it did a lot of damage to survivors of this type of abuse, right? Other Freud scholars argue that Mason and Rush have misinterpreted the reason and intention behind Freud's abandonment of the seduction theory and adoption of the theory of the Oedipus complex. According to Dr. Kurt R. Eisler, who replaced Mason as director of the Freud archives, Freud did not in any sense reject the reality of childhood sexual trauma, but realized that actual abuse was not the universal cause of neurosis he had thought it to be. New York psychiatrist Dr. Frank R. Hartman said that Freud realized he made a mistake in attributing all neurosis to repressed memories of actual abuse. So it doesn't have to be all or none, right? It could be like part and part, it doesn't have to be like, just one thing, right? He discovered a much broader theory which explained much more. The historian Peter Gay, another author of Freud, A Life for Our Time, 1988, emphasizes that Freud continued to believe that some patients were sexually abused, but realized that there can be difficulty in distinguishing between truth and fiction. Therefore, according to Gay, there was no sinister motive in changing his theory. Freud was a scientist seeking the facts and was entitled to change his views if new evidence was presented to him. Right? So then we have here gender roles and assumptions. This really disturbs me. Let me show you what I'm looking at. So many scholars and psychologists observe that because the theory of Oedipus complex assigns distinct roles to a mother and father, it is a poor fit for families that do not use traditional gender roles. As of November 2022, same-sex marriages is legal in 31 nations. Same-sex couples start families through adoption or surrogacy. The pillars of the family structure are diversifying to include parents who are single or the same sex as their partner, along with a traditional heterosexual married couple. These new family structures pose new questions for the psychoanalytical theories, such as the Oedipus complex, that require the presence of the mother and the father in the successive development of a child. Right? So now, because there's the exception of the acceptance and the exceptions of the gay couples, right? It could be like two mothers or two fathers. There's no, how could there be a rivalry, right, between like a male child pining for his mother's affection over his father's affection and vice versa, right? But then that leads me to believe that maybe some people, in a gay couple, they can have more masculine or female, like masculine or feminine attributes, so like sometimes, like I notice in a gay couple, like one person will have a more feminine personality and the other will have a more masculine personality, and they're both gay and they're both men, right? So yeah, so how does that work? It gets very complicated, right? Right? So like, what do you think? red beard. It's very complicated. My earliest memories are of the sky, the sun, of the big old booty in the sky with clouds. It's very complicated and dark. Read. I'm reaching for the sky, bum bum. He's writing in the early 1990s. Yeah. But I feel like not much has changed in the past 100 years when it comes to human behavior. You know what I mean? So let's go back to this, okay? Okay, so evidence suggests children who have been raised by parents of the same sex are not much different from children raised in traditional family structure. The classic theory of the Oedipal trauma has fallen out of favor in today's society, according to a study by Dresker, having been criticized for its negative implications towards same-sex parents. I don't know how I feel about same-sex parents raising children. I don't know how I feel about it, you know? Many psychoanalytical thinkers, such as Chodorow and Corbett, are working towards changing the Oedipus complex to eliminate automatic associations among sex, gender, and the stereotypical psychological functions derived from these categories and making it applicable to today's modern society. Excuse me. From its Freudian conception, psychoanalysis and its theories have always relied on traditional gender roles, to draw itself out. In the 1950s, psychologists distinguished different roles in parenting for the mother and father. The role of primary caregiver is assigned to the mother. Motherly love was considered to be unconditional, blah, 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 blah. Stretch theory. Then there's the stretch theory. Understanding the Oedipus complex as a way of explaining how human beings are socialized. Learning to deal with disappointment. You know, I wonder if, children that are born into, like, same-sex, are brought up by same-sex couples, I wonder if they develop the Oedipus complex with other people outside of their families, such as other adults that have influence on their life, such as uncles or aunts, you know what I mean, or grandparents, or yeah. Right? This is important discussions we're having. I think this is very important. Okay. So, aversion to incest. Parent, child, and siblings' incestuous unions are almost universally forbidden. An explanation for this incest taboo is that rather than instinctual sexual desire, there is instinctual sexual aversion against these unions. Steven Pinker wrote that the idea that boys want to sleep with their mothers strikes most men as the silliest thing that they ever heard. Obviously did not seem so to Freud, who wrote that as a boy, he once had an erotic reaction to watching his mother dressing. Of note is that Amalia Nathanson Freud was relatively young during Freud's childhood, and thus of reproductive age, and Freud, having a wet nurse, may not have experienced the early intimacy that would have tipped off his perceptual system that Mrs. Freud was his mother. Oh my God. In the old days, they would have people who would be wet nurses that would basically, they would take the place of the mother, and they would just be there to feed the baby. A wet nurse is a woman who breastfeeds and cares for another child. Wet nurses are employed if the mother dies or if she is unable to choose not to nurse a child herself. Wet nurse children may be known as milk siblings, and in some cultures the families are linked to. Let's go read about that. Oh my God. Just kidding. Wow, this is a real rabbit hole. Wet nurses are employed if the mother dies. Right? So the families are linked by a special relationship of milk kinship. Wet nursing exists in cultures around the world until the invention of reliable formula milk in the 20th century. Until the invention of formula. The practice has made a small comeback in the 21st century. So, I wonder how it worked with how did a woman stay wet, throughout all the years? Because I did hear, I don't know if it was a crime story or something, that, this guy, he was being nursed by his mother, and he was going to get married to some other woman, and he was sucking his mommy's boobies because he was, and his fiance walked in, and he saw that, and she thought that he's cheating on her, and meanwhile he was just sucking his mama's titties to to get milk. You know, it's so sick, right? This is sick stuff, isn't it, huh? Isn't it? Isn't it? He was writing in the early 90s, you need a father. Now single mothers are celebrated. Yeah, everyone needs a father, exactly. Father had the bigger lightning bolt. I will have a woman with the biggest booty ever. That will show him. Electricity is irritating anyway. Did he swallow? He was drinking his mama's titties. Gross. Okay, so going back to the... Where were we? The titties. The wet nurse. Where are we? Hold on. Okay, so people that shared the same wet nurse, they were considered like milk kinship. A wet nurse can help when a mother is unable or unwilling to breastfeed her baby before the development of infant formula. So they're basically saying that because Sigmund Freud was nursed by a wet nurse, he didn't have that same mother-child bond that he would have had if he would have just nursed with his mother. You know, so because he didn't have that attachment, that natural attachment that comes through breastfeeding, when he saw his mother, he had this erotic desire, you know, so then that's his problem. You know what I mean? Right? Right? So, yeah. Yeah, let's go there. He had a wet nurse. He may not have experienced early intimacy that would have tipped off his perceptual system that Mrs. Freud was his mother. In Esquisse pour une auto-analysis, Pierre Bourdieu argues that the success of the concept of Oedipus is inseparable from the prestige associated with ancient Greek culture and the relations of domination that are reinforced in the use of this myth. In other words, if Oedipus was Bantu or Baul, his story would probably not be viewed as human universal. This remark recalls the historically, socially situated character of the founder of psychoanalysis. Sexism. Feminist views on the Oedipus complex include criticism of the phallocentrism, which is the ideology that the phallus, or the male sexual organ, is a central element in the organization of the social world. They criticize that. They don't like that the penis is, makes the world go round, right? So, phallocentrism has been analyzed in literal criticism, psychoanalysis and psychology, linguistics, medicine and healthcare and philosophy. Yeah. So, the theory that the penis makes the world go round, they don't like that, right? Among others. Irigaray charges that Freud's work assumes a masculine perspective, epitomized by the centrality of the penis, or lack of penis for girls in the Oedipus complex. So there's that idea that girls get jealous when they see that the boys have a penis and they don't have one. She thinks that the Freud's desire for a neat symmetrical theory leads him to a contrived understanding of women as inverse men. So women are men, but they just have penis inverted. She charges that he does not explore mother-daughter relationships and that he has dogmatically assumes female sexuality will be the perfect mirror of male sexuality. Interesting. Right? So, okay, so a study conducted at Glasgow University potentially supports at least some aspects of the psychoanalytical conception of the Oedipus complex. The study demonstrated that men and women were twice as likely to choose a partner with the same eye color as the parent of the sex they are attracted to. Another study by anthropologist Alan W. Johnson and the psychiatrist Douglas Price Williams suggests that the classic version of the Oedipus complex that boys go through is present, with the sexual and aggressive sentiments less repressed in cultures and without class separation. Another study examines adoptive daughters and choice of husband. The study attempts to distinguish conceptually phenotypic matching from positive sexual imprinting. Phenotypic matching can be understood as an individual's seeking, presumably without conscious awareness, traits in mates that are similar to their own phenotype. Sexual imprinting can be understood as mates' preferences that are influenced by experience and observations with parents, caregivers in early age childhood. Adopted daughters are examined in part to disentangle these two influences. The results of the study support positive sexual imprinting, independent of phenotypical matching, which is the penis. I still don't understand that. Whatever. I don't understand this. So that's that. Going back to the idea of the sexual, his problems with sexual abuse, right? So yeah, going back to that, right? Are we? Yeah? Going back to that? You were nursed, were you? Really? Then I grew up. We help make life if you carry it. My peen points to Galactic Center in North on occasion. Men look for a woman similar to one that raised them, a mother. Interesting. Color, shape, phenotype. Yeah, so back to the sexual abuse thingy, right? Right? Okay. We're done with the Oedipus complex. Now we go back to Freud being uncomfortable with the fact that people were getting sexually abused, right? I watched like this whole series on like Freud and his whole sexual escapades and everything. And it was very strange and it was creepy. And I couldn't understand it. They were talking in German. Yeah. Let's make this go a little higher. Yeah. So, early in Freud's career, he believed that girls often experienced sexual abuse. Since most of his patients were women and consistently reported childhood instances of sexual molestation, many of Freud's patients suffered from a common Victorian diagnosis, hysteria. Since his hysterical patients repeatedly reported sexual abuse, most often naming their fathers as the abusers, Freud drew a causal connection between sexual abuse and neurosis. This became the frame for the seduction theory, in which he pointed to a direct connection between sexual abuse in childhood and adult hysteria. I think it's also connected, like people who have like mental problems later on in life, a lot of the time it's triggered by some sort of trauma, not necessarily sexual abuse, but some sort of childhood trauma. According to Florence Rush, an author of Freudian Cover-Up, this repeated and persistent incrimination of fathers by his patients made him uneasy, right? So he didn't want to face them. And led him to abandon the seduction theory, more at ease with the fantasy rather than reality of sexual abuse. Freud was even more comfortable when he could name the mother rather than the father as the seducer, hence the Oedipal complex. So the Oedipal complex is the son kills his father to marry his mother, thus the mother is the seducer. Other feminists who supported Rush's claims are Susan Brown Miller, Louis Armstrong, and Diana Russell. Before Freud could conclude that the seduction by fathers was a fantasy, he had to be rid of his earlier theories, since men did not complain of maternal seduction. Freud limited the imagined abuse to a specific female problem. To remove the responsibility from fathers of being the perpetrators, Freud found it necessary to undermine the perception of his female patients by basically telling them that it didn't really happen to you and it's just a fantasy that you want to have sex with your father. Not nice. It's like literal gaslighting. That's the definition of gaslighting. Within the period between the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, arguments were made that Freud abandoned his initial beliefs in women's accounts of abuse, the seduction theory, and replaced it with the Oedipal theory. This illustrates the ways in which he withheld or altered information from his patients, which is unacceptable in a professional context. And I seem to remember from watching his videos, like videos of him, was that he would a lot of the time use hypnosis to find out about everything, like in the past, right? Repressed feelings. So the Freudian cover exposed Freud's theory, the refusal to name the offender, But furthermore, one man's attempt to hide illegal or immoral sex practices. It was within this time that Victorian men were permitted to indulge in forbidden sex, provided they managed to keep their discretions hidden. Freud, who regarded the incest taboo as vital to the advance of civilization, appeared to demand only that forbidden sex be practiced with tact and discretion, so that the surface of Victorian respectability was in no way disturbed. So he did respect the fact that he didn't want incest to become normalized, because then it would be the destruction of the civilization. So he kind of tried to push that down, and that whole idea of, the sexual abuse or any type of this idea of anything incestual, anything child abuse, anything, he wanted to push it down to basically protect the normalcy of society, and the fact that, like, basically pretending that such things don't exist, and thus preserving the society and not making it corrupt and perversion normal. Does that make sense? So that's why he said that, like, forbidden sex should be practiced with tact and discretion, and he wanted this type of thing to stay taboo, so that the surface of Victorian respectability was in no way disturbed. Therefore, any attempt on the part of the child or her family to expose the violator exposes her own alleged innate sexual motives and shamed her more than the offender. Concealment is her only recourse. So she had to shut up in order to not expose the offender, right? And to keep society intact by keeping this type of stuff taboo, and also, not acknowledging that it exists. It kind of reminds me of, like, for example, in Russia, there are lots of people who are mentally ill, but nobody talks about it and nobody knows about it. Why? Because these people are basically suppressed, and they're kept in, like, locked up in houses and stuff, and they're not allowed out, so you don't see them in the street. Unresolved trauma leads to psychological problems outside of organicity. Yes. Back to that, right? Okay, so criticism. The historian Peter Gay, author of Freud, A Life of Our Time, in 1988, emphasizes that Freud continued to believe that some patients were sexually abused, but realized that there was a difficulty in determining between truth and fiction. Therefore, according to Gay, there was no sinister motive in changing his theory. Freud was a scientist seeking the facts, and he was entitled to change his views if new evidence was presented to him. A different criticism comes from Freud's scholars, who had examined the original documents and argued that the above account contains several misconceptions. So there's a lot of, like, documented his writings, and his, like, Freud must have a lot of his documents, that he wrote down all of his, like, from his research, with all these people talking about their traumas and everything. He must have it written down somewhere, and there must be books about it, you know what I'm saying? So Florence Rush based her account on Freud's later retrospective reports of the 1895-1997 episode, which are seriously at variance with the original 1896 papers and other documents, which show that it is not the case that Freud's female patients at that time consistently reported childhood instances of sexual molestation. Prior to the 1896 papers, he had not reported a single instance of early childhood sexual abuse, and very few cases of any kind of sexual abuse. The very essence of the seduction theory entailed that only unconscious memories of early childhood sexual abuse could result in hysterical or obsessional symptoms, which is inconsistent with the notion of patients coming to him with reports of childhood sexual abuse. On Freud's theory, the putative memories were deeply repressed and not accessible to the consciousness in normal circumstances. So all those memories were pushed down, and they weren't accessible to your consciousness. It was like something that's unconscious and something that you don't think about. It's something deep down you never think about. It's also the case that Freud's 1896 clinical claims were not restricted to women. In the 1896 paper, The Etiology of Hysteria, 1/3 of the patients were men. So the etiology of Hysteria is a paper by Sigmund Freud about the sexual abuse of children below the age of puberty and its possible causation of mental illness in adults. So it's also about men too. It's not just women, you know. And now it's come out, right, that 1 in 6 boys gets abused as a child, and 1 in 4 girls gets abused as a child. Freud twice stated that he would be presenting the clinical evidence for his claims, but he never did so, which critics have argued means that his clinical claims have had to be taken largely on trust. Numerous Freud scholars and academics have voiced serious doubts about the validity of his claim in 1896 to have uncovered unconscious memories, later conscious fantasies of infantile sexual abuse, mostly below the age of 4. It's very hard to remember this stuff before the age of 4, you know? When a person, you know, turns 4, it's hard to remember your memories from 3, 2, 1. You know what I mean? So, okay, so here it talks about other stuff, right? Oh. Okay, so then it talks about Freud's own experience with his own father and mother, you know? And this is very interesting why he became obsessed over this whole type of developing all these theories and doing research into like sex and the mind. You know what I'm saying? Hi, Albert. Lacking certain brain structures manifested in psychopathic issues, organicity. Hi, Albert. Yeah, so I'm gonna continue. I am the fart queen. I'm gonna continue I'm just gonna get water. Okay, so we're going to continue with this whole, what happened to him, right? Let's go talk about his life, you know, which is really interesting. Okay. Fine. So, development of psychoanalysis, right? So, in October 1885, Freud went to Paris in a 3-month fellowship study with Jean-Martin Charcot, a renowned neurologist who was conducting scientific research on hypnosis. He was later to recall the experience of his stay as catalytic in turning him towards the practice of medical psychopathology and away from a less financially promising career in neurology research. Charcot specialized in the study of hysteria and susceptibility to hypnosis, which he frequently demonstrated with patients on stage in front of an audience. Once he set up a private practice in Vienna in 1886, Freud began using hypnosis in his clinical work. As I said before, he was using hypnosis. He adopted the approach of his friend and collaborator Joseph Breuer in a type of hypnosis that was different from the French methods he had studied. And it was about the talking cure, something called the talking cure. He yeah, I spoke about this in the other thing about how he was encouraged them to talk, you know, and he called it the free association, you know, and it's really good for them, I think. Freud's development of this new theory, blah, blah, blah. Freud's development of these new theories took place during a period in which he experienced heart irregularities, disturbing dreams, and periods of depression, neurasthenia, which he linked to the death of his father in 1896, and which prompted a self-analysis of his own dreams and memories of childhood. His exploration of his feelings and hostility to his father and rivalry, jealousy over his mother's affections led him to fundamentally revise his theory of the origin of the neurosis. So he's basically had mommy issues, just like Redbeard said. He literally had mommy issues. Based on his early clinical work, Freud postulated that unconscious memories of sexual molestation in early childhood were a necessary precondition for psychoneurosis, hysteria, and obsessed neurosis. In the light of his self-analysis, Freud abandoned the theory and that every neurosis can be traced back to the effects of infantile sexual abuse. So not all neuroses go back to infants being abused, but it goes back to it could be both. It could be both from abuse and from other stuff, right? The transition from the theory of infantile sexual trauma as a general explanation of how all neurosis originate to one that presupposes autonomous infantile sexuality provided the basis of Freud's subsequent formulation of a theory of the Oedipus complex. We read about that, right? Okay. Okay, so now it talks about polyamory. Who wants to talk about that? Should we talk about polyamory? Shall we? Okay. Let me show you what I'm looking at. Freud described the evolution of his clinical method and set out his theory of genetic origins of hysteria, demonstrated in several case histories in studies of hysteria published in 1895. The interpretation of dreams, in which following a critical review of existing theory, Freud gives detailed interpretations of his own and his patients' dreams in terms of wish fulfillments made subject to the repression and censorship of the dream work. I don't agree with this whole wish fulfillment thing. You know what I mean? Like, wow. His theory was basically like all these people that came and told him about like them being molested as children. This is their wish fulfillments. They dream about it, and it's a fantasy that they want, and it's not real, something that really happened to them, So he called it wish fulfillments made subject to the repression and censorship of the dream work. He then sets out the theoretical model of mental structure, the unconscious, preconscious, and conscious, on which this account is based. An abridged version, on dreams, was published in 1901. In works that would win him a more general readership. Freud applied his theories outside the clinical setting in the psychopathology of everyday life, 1901, and jokes and their relation to the unconscious, 1905. In 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, published in 1905, Freud elaborates his theory of infantile sexuality, describing its polyamorous and perverse forms and the functions of the drives to which it gives rise in the formation of sexual identity. The same year, he published fragment of analysis of a case of hysteria, which became one of his more famous and controversial case studies, known as the Dora case study. For Freud, it was illustrative of hysteria as a symptom and contributed to his understanding of the importance of transference as a clinical phenomena. In other of his early studies, Freud set out to describe the symptomatology of obsessional neurosis in the case of Ratman and the phobia in the case of Little Hand. Who was Ratman? Ratman was... Let's open this. Ratman was a nickname given to Sigmund Freud to a patient whose case history was published as Birkungen Fall. This was the second case of a case history that Freud published, and the first which he claimed that the patient had been cured by psychoanalysis. A set of theories and therapeutic techniques that deal in part with the unconscious mind, and which together form a method of treatment for mental disorders. The discipline was established. So it's therapeutic techniques to deal with the unconscious mind and cure them. The nickname derives from the fact that among the patient's many compulsions was an obsession with nightmarish fantasies about rats. Gosh, I'm telling you, I'm sure there's a book out there of all his experiences with investigating all the people that he had to deal with in order to do his research, right? So, to protect the anonymity of the patient, psychoanalytical case studies usually withheld or disguised the names of the individuals concerned. Anna O, Little Hands, Wolfman, Dora, etc. Recent researchers have decided that the Ratman was in fact a lawyer named Ernst Lanzer, though many other sources maintain that the man's name was Paul Lorenz. Lanzer first came to Freud in October 1907, complaining of obsessive fears and compulsive impulses. Freud treated his patient for a little over 3 months on a regular daily basis. The treatment was irregular for the next 3 months and sporadic at best after that. Lanzer's principal fear was that something terrible was going to happen to his father and a female friend who later became his wife. His fear had grown out of an account he heard from a fellow army officer concerning a Chinese torture method in which a large pot... I can't. It's not funny. It's really not funny, but you can't make this stuff up. I dig chicks. Can't make this stuff up. So, hold on. His fear was that he heard about this, the Chinese torture. A fellow army officer concerning a Chinese torture method in which a large pot containing a live rat was strapped to the buttocks of the victim, and the rat, encouraged by a red-hot poker, would gnaw its way out through the victim's anus. Oh my god. Lanzer claimed that he fantasized about murder and suicide, and he developed a number of compulsive irrational behavior patterns. For example, he mentioned his habit of opening the door to his flat between 12 midnight and 1 a.m., apparently so that his father's ghost could enter. Lanzer would then stare at his penis, sometimes using a mirror. Freud encouraged Lanzer to discuss details of his sex life, such as his first effort at masturbation at the age of 20, and focused on a number of verbal associations with the words ratten, rats. Lanzer introduced Freud to Friedrich Nietzsche's phrase, which Freud later cited: "I did this," says my memory. "I cannot have done this," says my pride, and remains inexorable. In the end, memory yields. In the end, memory goes down. So you know, if you have a memory that you did something and your pride says, "I could not have done this," in the end your memory will fade and your pride will win and say, "I could not have done this, I didn't do it," right? So Freud retold the saying more than once, and it was used by later therapists such as Fritz Perls. Lanzer broke off his analysis with Freud after a relatively brief period, and well before his transference had been fully resolved. Just after Freud had completed the written version of the case history in October 1909, he confessed to Carl Jung that his patient was having ongoing problems. Lanzer was killed in World War I, and later researchers were unable to interview him. Oh my god. So he had like all these like notes, you know? So I'm sure they've taken his notes and made it into books, so you can buy his book and read all about his patients. That must be really interesting, right? So okay, so Freud's write-up notes upon a case of obsessional neurosis. So it just goes on, and it's very interesting, you know? So going back to, so that was one example of one of his patients. Going back to his earlier followers, it talks about him having people who followed him and learned from him, right? Where are we? Right. Did he turn into his father? I don't know. I have to see in the end. I'm almost done. Let me see if my friend's coming. Let me go see. Hi. Hi, guten Tag. Hi, guten Tag. How are you? Okay. So in 1902, Freud at last realized his long-standing ambition to be made a university professor, the title professor extraordinarius, was important to Freud for the recognition and prestige it conferred. There being no salary or teaching duties attached to the post, he would be granted the enhanced status of professor ordinarius. In 1920, despite support from the university, his appointment had been not blocked in successive years by the political authorities, and it was secured only with the intervention of the influential ex-patient Baroness Mary Furstel, who supposedly had to bribe the Minister of Education with a valuable painting. Excuse me. Freud continued with a regular series of lectures on his work, which, since the mid-1880s, as a docent of Vienna University, he had been delivering to small audiences every Saturday evening at the lecture hall of the University Psychiatric Clinic. From the autumn of 1902, a number of Viennese physicians had also expressed interest in Freud's work, were invited to meet at his apartment every Wednesday afternoon to discuss his stuff. Freud founded this discussion group at the suggestion of the physician Wilhelm Stekel. Stekel had studied medicine. His conversion to psychoanalysis is variously attributed to successful treatment by Freud for a sexual problem or as a result of his reading the interpretation of dreams, to which he subsequently gave a positive review in the Viennese daily newspaper, Neues Wiener Tagblatt. The other three original members whom Freud invited to attend was Alfred Adler, Max Kahane, and Rudolf Reitler, were also physicians, and all five were Jewish by birth. Both Kahane and Reitler were childhood friends of Freud who had gone to university with him and kept abreast of Freud's developing ideas by attending his Saturday evening lectures. In 1901, Kahane, who first introduced Steckel to Freud's work, had opened an outpatient psychotherapy institute, of which he was the director in Vienna. Okay, so then, okay, so it just tells us all who were following him, right? Reassignment from the IPA. Some of Freud's followers subsequently withdrew from the International Psychoanalysis Association. Early psychoanalytical movement. After the founding of the Thing, Abraham and Eddington founded the Berlin Psycho. Let me show you what I'm looking at, so you can follow with me. So it just goes down from here, right? Okay, so what happened to him, right? So Joseph Stalin came to power, after which psychoanalysis was denounced on ideological grounds. The 1910 Moscow Psychoanalytical Society became the Russian Psychoanalytical Society and Institute in 1922. Freud's Russian followers were the first to benefit from translations of his work. The 1904 Russian translation of the Interpretation of Dreams, appearing 9 years before Brill's English edition. The Russian Institute was unique in receiving state support for its activities, including publication of translations of Freud's work. Support was abruptly annulled when Joseph Stalin came to power, and his analysis was denounced on ideological grounds because Joseph Stalin was a fucking dictator. Yeah, so then there was a clinic that was established in 1922 under the directorship of Helen Dutch. Psychoanalysis Society institutions were established in Switzerland, in Palestine, and Jerusalem. Who fled Adolf Hitler came to power. The New York Psychoanalysis Institution was founded in 1931. Okay, in 1922, Berlin Congress was the last Freud attended. By his time, his speech had become seriously impaired by the prosthetic device he needed as a result of a series of operations on his cancerous jaw. He kept abreast development through regular correspondence with his principal followers, blah, blah, blah. In 1930, Freud received the Goethe Prize in recognition of his contributions to psychology and German literary culture. Yeah, so he had some sort of importance at the time of his in his time, and this goes to show that the Jewish people, all we've ever really done was all we've ever really done is contribute to society, right, in whichever way, and we're not appreciated for it. And it's really sad because, the Islamic community never really contributed much to the world, and the Nazi Germany didn't appreciate what we contributed to their society, and they demonized us and lied about us, and in the end, they did a Holocaust. They killed us, So what will you dream of, lady? What will I dream of? I don't know. I don't have dreams anymore. You know what I mean? Maybe it's a good thing. Okay, patients. Freud used pseudonyms in his case history. Some patients known by pseudonyms was Calcil M. So if I go through his patients and read their cases, I'm sure it would be really interesting. We'll probably do that another time, but it talks about him in February 1923. Freud detected leukemia a benign growth associated with heavy smoking in his mouth. He kept it a secret, but he had to tell someone. They had to get it removed. It wasn't leukemia, it was epithelioma. By Marcos Hajek, a rhinologist whose competence had previously been questioned. Hajek performed an unnecessary cosmetic surgery in his clinic's outpatient department. Freud bled during and after the operation and may narrowly have escaped death. At a subsequent visit, Deutsch saw that further surgery would be required but did not tell Freud he had cancer because he was worried that Freud might commit suicide. Escape from Nazism. Wow. Okay, so let's read this again, right? We'll read this again. Go back. Wait, go back. Okay, so in February 1923, Freud detected leukemia, a benign growth associated with heavy smoking in his mouth. He initially kept it a secret, but in April 1923, he informed Ernest Jones, telling them that the growth had been removed. Freud consulted with dermatologist Maximilian Steiner, who advised him to quit smoking but minimizing the growth's importance. He minimized the growth's importance. Freud later saw Felix Deutsch, who identified it to Freud using the euphemism a bad leukemia instead of the technical diagnosis epithelioma. Deutsch advised Freud to stop smoking and have the growth excised. Freud was treated by Marcos Hajek, a rhinologist, whose competence he had previously questioned. Hajek performed an unnecessary cosmetic surgery in his clinic's outpatient department. Freud bled during and after the operation and may narrowly have escaped death. So this guy almost killed him. At a subsequent visit, Deutsch saw that further surgery would be required and did not tell Freud that he had cancer because he was worried that Freud would kill himself. Escape from Nazism. In 1933, the Nazi Party took control of Germany, and Freud's books were prominent among those they burned because he was Jewish. Freud remarks to Ernest Jones, "What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Now they're content with burning my books." Freud, so he said, like, he was being very, he was being sarcastic. He's like, in the old days, he's like, what progress we are making. In the old days, they would have burned me alive, but now they're just burning my books. We're making such progress, right? Freud underestimated the growing Nazi threat and remained determined to stay in Vienna because in the end, it wasn't just his books. They wanted to kill him because he's a Jew. Freud underestimated the growing Nazi threat and remained determined to stay in Vienna, even following the Ausschluss of 13 March 1938 and the outbreaks of violent anti-Semitism that ensued. Jones, the then president of the International Psychoanalytical Association, flew into Vienna on the 15th of March, determined to get Freud to change his mind and seek exile in Britain. This prospect and the shock of the arrest and the interrogation of Anna Freud by the Gestapo finally convinced Freud it was time to leave. Who is Anna Freud? Was his wife or his... Oh my God. Jones left for London the following week with the list provided by Freud of the party of emigrants for whom immigration permits would be required back in London. Jones used his personal acquaintance with the Home Secretary, Sir Samuel Hoare, to expedite and grant the granting of permits. There were 17 in all, and work permits were provided and were relevant. Jones also used his influence in scientific circles, persuading the president of the Royal Society, Sir William Bragg, to write to the Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, requesting to good effect that diplomatic pressure be applied in Berlin and Vienna. On Freud's behalf, Freud also had support from American diplomats, notably his ex-patient and American ambassador to France, to the increased dangers facing the Freuds, resulting in the American Consul General in Vienna arranging regular monitoring of Burgasse 19. He also interviewed by phone during the Gestapo interrogation of Anna Freud. So the Gestapo were starting to torture the Jews, right? And the departure from Vienna began in stages. Freud's son Martin's wife and children left to Paris. Freud's sister-in-law Minna Bernays left to London. So they all escaped. Freud's daughter Matilda and her husband, they all ran away. By the end of the month, arrangements for Freud's own departure for London had become stalled. Damn. Wow. So he escaped, basically, and... Wow. Among the distinct quotes, respect, blah, blah, blah. Freud's 4 elderly sisters in Vienna. Her subsequent attempts to get them exits visas failed. So his 4 sisters died in concentration camps, Nazi concentration camps. In early 1939, they arrived in mysterious circumstances. Wow. Death. By mid-September 1939, Freud's cancer of the jaw was causing him increasingly severe pain, and he had been declared inoperable. It had been declared inoperable. That's really scary. The last book he read, Balzac's La Peau de Chagrin, prompted reflections on his own increasing frailty, and a few days later he turned to his doctor friend and fellow refugee Max Schur, reminding him that they had previously discussed the terminal stages of his illness. "Schur, you remember our contract not to leave me in the lurch when the time had to come? Now it's nothing but torture and makes no sense." When Schur replied that he had not forgotten, Freud said, "I thank you, and then talk it over with Anna, and if she thinks it's right, then make an end of it." Anna Freud wanted to postpone her father's death, but Schur convinced her it was pointless to keep him alive. On 21 and 22 September, he administered doses of morphine that resulted in Freud's death at around 3 a.m. On the 23rd of September 1939, however, discrepancies on the account of Schur gave of his role in Freud's final hours led to inconsistencies between Freud's main biographers. A revised account proposes that Schur was absent from Freud's deathbed when a 3rd and final dose of morphine was administered by Dr. Josephine Strauss, a colleague of Anna Freud, leading to Freud's death at around midnight on the 23rd of September 1939. 3 days after his death, Freud's body was cremated at Golders Green Crematorium, with Harrods acting as funeral directors. Blah, 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 blah. His wife, Martha, died in 1951. Her ashes were also placed in an urn. Right, so then it talks about his early works. He also did research on cerebral palsy, seduction theory. We discussed that. Oh, we didn't discuss the cocaine. He did research on cocaine and the unconscious mind, dreams, and we have to get through that, you know. So we did a seduction theory already, right? And now we have to do seduction theory, physiosexual development, ego, superego. We did that. Life and death drives, melancholia, which is people who are just in a state of mourning, feminine and female sexuality, religion, legacy, psychotherapy, science, philosophy, feminism. Yeah, it's interesting, There's a lot to talk about, and if I were really smart, I would go and get his books. You know what I'm saying? Because it's hard to read online. It's hard to read everything. You know what I'm saying? If a group says you're not a member, take heed and take your talents with you. Exactly. So, where are we? Hold on. I'm tired. Okay. Where are we? As a medical researcher, Freud was an early user and proponent of cocaine as a stimulant as well as analgesic. He believed that cocaine was a cure for many mental and physical problems, and in his 1884 paper on coca, he extolled its virtues. Between 1883 and 1887, he wrote several articles recommending medical applications, including its uses as an antidepressant. He narrowly missed out on obtaining scientific priority for discovering its aesthetic properties, of which he was aware but had mentioned only in passing. Karl Koller, a colleague of Freud's in Vienna, received that distinction in 1884 after reporting to a medical society the ways cocaine could be used in delicate eye surgery. Freud also recommended cocaine as a cure for morphine addiction. He had introduced cocaine to his friend Ernst von Fleisch-Marxow, who had become addicted to morphine taken to relieve years of excruciating nerve pain resulting from an infection acquired after injuring himself while performing an autopsy. Wow. His claim that Fleischler-Marxo was cured of his addiction was premature, though he never acknowledged that he had been at fault. Fleisch-Marxo developed an acute case of cocaine psychosis. So cocaine brought on probably schizophrenia or something, and soon returned to using morphine, dying a few years later, still suffering from intolerable pain. The application as an anesthetic turned out to be one of the few safe uses of cocaine. And as reports of addiction and overdose began to filter in from many places in the world, Freud's medical reputation became somewhat tarnished. Listen, you can't be perfect, right? After the cocaine episode, Freud ceased to publicly recommend the use of the drug, but continued to take it himself occasionally for depression, migraine, and nasal inflammation during the early 1890s, before discontinuing its use in 1896. Something I don't understand is when I saw the movies of Freud, he was constantly having sex with all his patients, you know? He was trying to do all his analysis and all his stuff through experimentation, physically, fucking his patients. It was the strangest thing. So I don't know how he got away with that while he was married, you know? Or if his life just let him do that, you know? And how his patients just had sex with him because what? You know, he promised to cure them? I don't get it, right? Yeah, the conscious dreams. Dreams, interesting. Yeah, so then it goes from there and it goes down, right? Melancholia. Interesting. Okay, so that's that. We'll have to continue this another day. We covered cocaine and what's this? That's that. And yeah. So that's that, right? If a analgesic, what's that? Most illicit drugs were over the counter back then. Yeah, I don't understand it, to be honest. You know what I'm saying? Anyways, that's that, right? Religion, psychotherapy, science, all his works, philosophy. I think next time I talk about him, I'm going to talk about his patients, you know? I'm going to talk about his patients and other stuff about him, because, I'm sure there's books and books and books on him, you know? So if I look now, wait, what's abandonment? Okay, if I look now, for example, if I look now at what was it? Abandonment theory? No, what was it? What do I want to look at? Oh, his books. Freud books. Showing for Freud books. Right, so there's the interpretation, Freud the interpretation. Civilization and its discontent, the interpretation, general introduction, totem and taboo, the psychology. Most famous and influential books by Sigmund Freud. Studies on hysteria, interpretation of dreams, psychopathology of everyday life, 1901. 3 essays on theory of sexuality, jokes and their relation to the unconscious. Totem and Taboo, book on narcissism. So he thinks that the libido, right, sex and narcissism is very intertwined. Introduction to Psychoanalysis, 1917. Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920. He explores his theory of instincts in greater depth, right? So the pleasure principle, the future of an illusion. He describes his own ideas about the origins and the development of religion, and suggests that religion is an illusion made up of certain dogmas, assertions about facts and conditions of external and internal reality, which tell one something that one has not oneself discovered, and which claims that one should give them credence. Civilization and its discontents, Moses and monotheism. Wow, this was Freud's final work and perhaps one of his most controversial. Despite the criticism of Freud's speculative take on history, the book can spark a question about the psychological origins of monotheistic religion. A word from very well. Okay, so he did a few books, right? So, wow, here's much more stuff about him. Yeah, so that's that. I have a lot to go on, you know what I'm saying? That's great. So okay, that's that, right? Get nervous when I'm going out, right? I'm going out with a friend, right? Freud. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. So, what I'm gonna do is put on my boots. Here we go. Try not to burn your mind out. Have fun. Thanks. I need to do more reading. You know, I really need to do more reading on this stuff because I think it's important to exercise your brain. You know what I mean? The problem is when I read, I do reading online, here I'm reading it and my voice, I get tired. My voice starts my throat gets scratchy. Yeah. So interesting because I never really had any attachments to either parent in a obsessed way, like Freud describes. You know what I'm saying? It's interesting. I guess some people have, like Freud had weird stuff going on, with his parents. Like attraction to his mother. You know what I'm saying? Interesting. Are you ready? Let's go. Money. This. This. Just need. That's 60 here. 60 shekel. I'm going to a party. I'm going to a party. I'm going to a party. should make myself a tea. Before I go, so that I'm not like stressed. You know? Myself a tea. And then let me interesting theory though. It's a very interesting theory because it's actually a very interesting theory because it's like, I guess there are parents that, like, there's this whole concept also of like emotional incest and all that stuff, right? So yeah, let's go see this. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. History of the book, criticism. Okay, whatever, never mind. Fine. It's been real. Thank you guys for being here. And feel free to subscribe, blah blah blah. Have a great day. And that's that.